need to shut down our phones, as I heard mine dinging as Bill was praying, so guilty. Okay, we are continuing our study on Wednesday nights on the fruit of the Spirit, and we've already covered love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, and goodness, and tonight we're going to talk about faithfulness. So we will discuss that. Is there anyone have any comments they want to make about anything we've talked about to this point that they just have to share? Hearing none. Now, when we talk about faithfulness, a lot of people will think of faith, and while faith is important for our Christianity, we have to have faith in order to be a Christian, but faithfulness is much different, as we talk about that tonight. In a Dennis the Menace cartoon, Dennis holds up a handful of flowers to Mr. Wilson and asks, "How can anything so pretty and clean come out of dirt?" So we might ask the same question about God's children. In Galatians, the 5th chapter, in 16 to 21, the Apostle Paul outlines all the ugliness of the flesh. He then overwhelms his readers with the beauty of God's Spirit, and the fruit of the Spirit brings, and one of those that we're going to study tonight is faithfulness. Our society is becoming increasingly self-centered. People quickly discard spouses, friends, work, and promises if they perceive that they have outlived their usefulness to them. Too many people today, faithfulness applies to only one person, and that's themselves. But when the Spirit develops this fruit of faithfulness in our lives, the results are quite different. So today what we'll do is study faithfulness and how it applies to our lives and how we can be better at being faithful. The word faithfulness in the original Greek is pistis and is translated as faith in some older versions of the Bible, but most newer versions translate it, as it does in Galatians 5, as faithfulness. So when we think about faithfulness, it's the trustworthiness and reliability. It is an inner strength and quality of one who has yielded his life to the Spirit of God. The man or woman who, with spiritual fruit of faithfulness, can be counted on, is dependable, and can be trusted. Faithfulness is a fruit of the Spirit which is steadily influenced in shaky and uncertain times. So if you think about the world that we live in, the world that you live in, we each have to think about our own situations. And can you be considered faithful, reliable, dependable, or are you the opposite? What's the opposite of dependable? Unreliable. Unreliable. Can anyone think of anyone who's been unreliable in their work life or in their life where maybe it's a situation where you've had someone that was going to pick you up to go somewhere. You have to be somewhere at a specific time, and they're going to pick you up at a certain time, but yet when that certain time arrives, you're still waiting, and you're waiting. And how does that make you feel when you have that situation? Anxious, very anxious. Obviously, it depends on the situation. If you're just going somewhere, but if it's like golf and you have a tee time, that if you miss the tee time, well, then you're in trouble because they've let other people go ahead. If it's dinner and you have reservations at a nice restaurant, maybe they've given up your reservation because you didn't show up. Maybe if it's a job interview, it doesn't start well when you don't get there on time. When you're late for an interview, that doesn't set a good tone. So when you think about faithfulness, and part of it is reliability, faithfulness is a word that we don't hear often these days. It's a word usually reserved for retirement parties. After 25 years of faithful service, a worker gets a gold watch. When most of us think of the word faithful, we think of things that are old. You know, you might have a dog that has been faithful. It might be old and ugly, but she's faithful. Maybe you have a car that's old, but it starts all the time, but it's faithful. So faithful means reliability, trustworthy, dependable, consistent. Faithfulness is a rare quality, and it's not easy to find someone who you can really count on. In Proverbs chapter 20, verse 6, the wise man there tells us, most men will proclaim each his own goodness, but who can find a faithful man? So think about what that says. Most men will proclaim their own goodness, but who can find a faithful man? Do you know anybody like that could boost their own horn, that can talk about all the things that they do and don't do? In Luke the 18th, I'm sorry? David says sometimes you do have to toot your own horn because no one else will toot it for you. So, sometimes that happens. But hopefully you don't have to do the tooting because your actions toot it for you. But I guess it depends on the situation. If obviously you're in a job interview, well, you have to toot your own horn. If you're trying to do something where part of your reliability is something that you have to toot. But yeah, sometimes you might have to do it on your own. Anybody else have anything to add to that? Ignore it. In Luke 18, verse 11, we have there the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Basically, what he talks about there is the Pharisee. In verse 11, it says, the Pharisee stood and prayed this with himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, and even as this tax collector. So there, it's talking about the Pharisee, but what's the Pharisee doing when he's praying? How is he praying? Yeah, and he's standing so people can see him, and he's boastful, and then basically talking about someone else who is praying, humbly praying, and that he's thankful that he's not like someone like that. In Matthew, the 23rd chapter, we have the Pharisees brought out there, and it says, but all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. So there the Pharisees are trying to make sure people realize who they are and what they've done and their accomplishments. And then in Matthew chapter 6, verse 2, therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound the trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. But surely I say to you, they have their reward. So, obviously, he's talking there about those who try to get, who basically, like Proverbs says, they proclaim their own goodness. They basically show what I've done. Look what I've done. Look what I've accomplished. There are people who do give well, who give a lot. I mean, you'll have a lot of colleges and universities that people will give, and they'll put their name on a building. I don't think they give so that their name gets put on a building. Maybe some do. But sometimes those who do have the means, they do those things. Amanda obviously moved to Florida, and while we were there, one of the playgrounds that they went to, there's a church there, and a couple basically came, I believe they came from Oklahoma, and they had funds, so they bought this land and they started a church, but they also had a playground. And the thought was, my thought when I read what they do, is that here's two individuals who did have the means, but yet they were able to spread the seed, plant the seed, and a lot of people saw the benefits of what they did because they shared it with others. Their name was tied to it because they did it, but they didn't do it for that intent. So it's good that we can do things for others, and not always do we do it so we get a pat on the back. So we should strive to be faithful for a couple reasons. The first reason we should be faithful to God is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 3, and it says, but the Lord is faithful, who will establish you and guard you from the evil one. Since God desires for us to be like him, he wants us to learn to be faithful. Another reason we should be faithful is that God rewards faithfulness. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 10, a promise is made, and that promise is, be faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. What more do we need? Right? I mean, what are we all working towards? A crown of life. We're living our life so that we can see this promise fulfilled in our lives. But to do that, we have to be faithful. The Bible says over and over that a faithful person will be richly blessed. So you want to be rewarded in heaven, you should learn how to become a faithful, dependable person. One of the most famous geysers in America is Old Faithful. It's at Yellowstone National Park. It's not the biggest geyser in America, nor is it the most powerful. But what makes it famous is its faithfulness. Basically, it sprouts or it shoots off about 20 times a day, and they can predict within 10 minutes of when that geyser is going to erupt. So people are there. They bank on it being done at that time so they can see. It shoots up from 100 to 180 feet in the air. Based on how much it shoots and the time it does, they can predict what it will do the next time because it's reliable. It does it over and over again. So while that's talking about a geyser, but on the flip side, think about the unfaithful person. In Proverbs chapter 25, verse 19, tells us that confidence is an unfaithful man in time of trouble. Let me read that again. Confidence in an unfaithful man in times of trouble is like a bad tooth and a foot out of joint. So in Proverbs 25, so back in the Old Testament time, they had toothaches and they had sprained ankles and got injured like we do today. So we have a reputation, and we can be reliable and dependable, or we could be the opposite. And so when we think about this verse, it tells us that if we have confidence in an unfaithful man in a time of trouble, it's like a bad tooth. So unreliable people are a pain. I don't have to tell you that. Obviously, all of us have been associated with someone that's not been reliable at times in our lives, and we know what that causes. But as Proverbs points out, it's like a bad toothache or a sore foot. And you know what it's like to have a toothache. It hurts. When you depend on an unreliable person, you can never quite relax. In the back of your mind, you're always wondering, will he let me down again, or will he come through this time? Working with inconsistent people is extremely frustrating, but God calls each of us to be faithful. So what I wanted to do is we'll look at 5 different areas that we can develop faithfulness in our lives. The first is your promises. In Proverbs 25, verse 14, it says, "Whoever falsely boasts of giving is like clouds and winds without rain." And we've all seen that. Clouds that look obviously like rain clouds, winds that blow, and then we get no rain. Now, sometimes that's a good thing, but I know back in the day when we would coach Little League Baseball, we would determine what we do sometimes by the clouds and the wind, and sometimes you might prematurely cancel the game anticipating what might be there, but then it doesn't rain. So he's saying that whoever falsely boasts of giving and doesn't do it, that it's like wind that doesn't provide rain. Do you know people like that make promises but never keep them? They tell you they'll do something but they never do. Be careful about the promises you make. We need to be dependable on what we say. We need to keep our promises. And again, like we've talked over and over on this class, as Christians, we have the fruit of the Spirit. So when it says these things, they're not options. So when we make a promise as a Christian, our responsibility is to keep that promise and to be dependable. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 5 says, "Better not to vow than to vow and not pay." So when you are faithful with your promises, you don't have to convince people that you are. You don't have to make a big deal of it. You don't have to say, "Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye." Remember that as kids, that we would say those things to try to make the point that we will do what we said we would do. So, but we don't have to do that if we're Christians. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 37 tells us, "But let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one." So when you think about promises that we make, do we make promises in our lives? Sure we do. Sure we do. We make a promise when we get married. We make a vow. We make, basically, when we become a Christian, we make a promise. And then many different times in our lives, we make promises that we'll do certain things. If we're in a medical field, or if you're a priest or someone like that, you take an oath that you'll uphold and do. So sometimes even in our jobs, we were required to make those promises. So if we do those things as Christians, we need to make sure that when we promise we're going to do something, that we do that. Any comments or anything to add on that? Jason?
Yeah, I think, commitment, faithfulness, promises, I think it's important, as Christians and wanting to be helpful and good people, a lot of times we'll say we want to do things, and how does that fall into a promise? But I think you have to be careful of saying, I'll do that or I'll help out with that. You want to be that helpful individual, but then you end up overcommitting, maybe you forgot you said that, and then you end up with that reputation of this person doesn't keep their commitments, if you will, instead of promises, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, good point. And what Jason said is we have to be careful sometimes where we try to take on too much, because we want to do right, we want to do good, but when you can't do, if you commit for 25 hours a day and you only have 24, obviously you can't do that. So we have to be careful when we make a commitment that we're going to do something that we can't do that. So as we look at the end of our year and we start next year, and as Judy puts things together, if you make a commitment, a promise that I'll do door greeter or I'll make communion, if you say you're going to make communion and then you're not here to prepare it, and then it comes time for the Lord's Supper and it's not there, who's that fall back on? So I know that's a strange, but if we say we're going to do something as Christians, we need to do that. We need to be reliable and dependable. Anyone else? Second area is our relationships. And we need to cultivate personal loyalty. A faithful person stands by his or her friends. Again, in Proverbs chapter 17, verse 17 says, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. So genuine friends are reliable and consistent. They can be counted on in a crisis. They can be relied on when the road gets rough. But notice in that verse they talk about two different groups of people. It talks about friends, and it also talks about relatives. Your in-laws might be outlaws, but they're still your in-laws. We need to cultivate faithfulness in our relationships. Someone has said, if you marry Ellie Mae, you get Jethro too. For the young people that don't know who that is, that's the Beverly Hillbillies. And just Google an episode. But we have family. So when we think about relationships with our families, they're important. If you're going to be faithful, we need to be faithful in all aspects of our relationship. Think about if you're a Christian and people know that you are a Christian and you attend the church, but then they know that you live in the same area as your parents maybe, or your brother or a relative, but they know you don't get along. How does that look to the community if we have that in our lives? Not good, does it? No. So, and again, as we look at this class, when it talks about what we put on every day, we talk about what we put on as a Christian every morning. If I'm a Christian every day, then I have to think about all of my actions. And one of the things we'll look at here in a minute is we can spend time thinking about regrets and things. And there's certain things that we can fix, but there's certain things that we can't. But if it's definitely our relationships with our families and our friends, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can on our part to cultivate those relationships and make sure that we are, on our side, we're faithful on our side. We can't control what other people do, but we can definitely control what we do. Correct? Yep. Yeah. Okay. No one wants to talk about family, huh? Another area is your abilities. We have to be faithful in our abilities. God has given us some spiritual abilities, talents, and gifts. He's made an investment in us, and he wants and expects a return on those investments. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10 says, And each one has received a gift, minister it one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. And if we do use our abilities that God's given us, if we don't use them, other people will miss out on what we have to offer. We need to become more faithful and use our abilities. When we use our abilities and the gifts and talents, that it matters. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 20 and 21, it talks about the church, and it says, "But now indeed there are many members, yet one body, and the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you." And then in verse 26, "And if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. And if one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it." So when we think about how we fit in and how we use our abilities and the talents that we have, we need to use those. Again, as a Christian, it's really not an option. So when Jason, who takes care of the men who do the worship, if he comes up and asks me to say a prayer, I'm going to say a prayer. Now, it may not be a good one, short notice or whatever, but I think it's important that we use the talents that God has given us and the abilities that he's given us. I think if we don't use those talents, so in other words, if you're a good teacher, but you opt not to teach for some reason, I think that's wrong. If you're a good leader, song leader, then you should be. I think that you have abilities that we need to utilize in the church for the Lord. Whatever those abilities are, we can use. It's not just in the worship, but in other things that we do. There's all kinds of things that happen around the building. And so it's important that we all work together, just as it talks about in 1 Corinthians about the body. So all the parts of the body affect all the other parts of the body. And Tim preached on this just a few weeks ago, that, obviously if I hit my thumb with the hammer, my whole body feels the pain of my thumb when I do that. We cannot all be brilliant, but we can all be faithful. And faithfulness is what counts with God. So we keep our promises, we build relationships, and we use our abilities. And then another area we can be faithful in is our time. Time is something we all have in common. Everyone has the same amount of time. We have 168 hours in a week. You can calculate that. I made sure that that's right. But we all have those 168 hours a week. That's all we have. We don't get any more. We don't get any less. But we all have that. In Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 and 16 says, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil." So you can do three things with your time. You can spend it, you can waste it, or you can invest it. So think about that. You can do three things. You can spend your time, you can waste it, or you can invest it. The best use of your time is to invest it in something that's going to outlast you. Faithfulness involves time management. There are two primary time wasters. One is regret, and one is worry. When we regret the past, we waste huge amounts of time looking backward to change something that we can't change anyway. Do we have regrets? Do all of us have regrets? Yeah, we do. Whatever it might be, whether it's the college that you chose to go to, the job that you might have taken, the car that you bought, whatever it might be. I hope it's not the spouse. But we have regrets. But we don't spend time wasting time on those regrets, because we can't change the past. We can only change the future. And then worry. What does it help to worry? What's it say about worrying in the Bible?
Be anxious for nothing.
Yeah, be anxious for nothing. So our job as Christians, and again, as Christians, it's difficult as the world looks at us, it's difficult for them to think about what we do like that, not to be anxious for anything. And we've talked about it in this class. Some of us, at times where you lost a job or something's happened, and while you haven't, overreacted, you just kind of take it as it is, because you know that it will work out in the end. And as Christians, that's what we have to do. We have to not be worried. We can't waste time on regret or worry. When we regret the past, we waste a huge amount of time looking back to change what we can't change. When we worry about the future, we waste time fretting over events that may not ever happen. Have we ever done that, worried about something that didn't happen? Yeah. But think about the time we wasted worrying about it, right? So we shouldn't worry. Oh, Becky's just grabbing her glasses. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13 says, "But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin." So, exhort one another daily. Now, how do we do that if we meet 2 times a week, 2 days a week? If we're Christians, this tells us, exhort one another daily while it's called today. Do we need to do more as Christians with our brothers and sisters on a daily basis? We can't eat together every day. We can't, but there are things we could do more. When we think about time, we talked about time. We all have 168 hours. But how do we use that time? What do we do with our time? If you're on Facebook, chances are a lot of us are on Facebook. Do you reach out and talk to somebody or try to reach them? If we have people who are here, if you have your phone, if you have their number, you can text them. There's things we should do more than what we do. That's just an opinion from Ned. But I think that we need to use our time wisely, and part of it is exhorting one another, it says daily. And we need to think about how we can do that and put some effort into it, because it does take effort. Especially as we look at the next year coming into 2022. What can I do different in my life than I didn't do this year? Maybe part of that is reach out to somebody daily. Phone call, a card, a text, an email, whatever it might be. But think about on the other side then, if you receive that daily. If all of a sudden you're at work and somebody from church texts you and says, "Hey, hope you have a good day." Or you'll go get a mail. You go to the mailbox and you get a card, other than just bills or solicitations for somebody wanting to buy your house, or your warranties are going to expire, or something like that with your vehicle. So I think we need to do more as we look at what we do in our lives. God understands your schedule, and He knows how you use your time. He probably knows more than ever anyone does. He understands it. So what should we do? In all things, go to God in prayer. If you're having a problem with time management, go to God in prayer. Ask Him to help you, and you'd be surprised what happens. Somebody knocks on your door, or somebody says, "Hey, let's do this or that," or some way, somehow, someone will help you with time management, how you can do more to be more productive as a Christian. When you try to burn a candle at both ends, you're not as bright as you think you are. You probably need to cut some of the things out, and God can help you make those choices. So make your time count. It's part of being faithful, so be faithful with that. Last item here then is giving. Your giving. Ooh, we're going to talk about that? God has given you resources, and how you handle money is a test of your faithfulness to Him. In Luke 16, "Therefore, if you have not been faithful in your unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches?" So think about, if we're not faithful with our money, with our income and assets, how will God be faithful? Amazingly, God says that if you're not faithful with your material possessions, He will not trust you with spiritual resources. So we need to ask ourselves, am I being a wise manager of money God has given me? I remember a long time ago, when I went to OVC, I went to church at Clifton Church of Christ in Cincinnati, and one of my brothers from there, Daryl Bradley, Skip, he was preaching at a small church by Miami University, small church of maybe 40 people. But when he decided to come to OVC also, one of the things that they did, and this was a small church, they didn't have a lot, but they had gone out and bought Skip a Bible. They knew he wanted to be a preacher student. They had gone out and bought him a very expensive study Bible. And he was impressed how they used their assets to help him, even though he knew that people had to make a commitment, had to really give in order to get that done. So he knew that they didn't have the means to do it, but they did it. So think about, what are we doing with what God's given us? the more we give, the more the church can give. But more importantly, God knows you, and he knows what you have and what you don't have. And so we will talk about it every week when we offer the offering, that we're all to plan and prepare before the time comes, and that we give back as we've been blessed. So when you think about faithfulness, part of that faithfulness then is also how we give. In Matthew chapter 12, or in Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44, we have where Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw the people had put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrum. So he calls his disciples to himself and says to them, "Surely I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she put out of her poverty, but she put in all that she had, her whole livelihood." So I'm not telling you how you should use your money. That's between you and God. But when we look at these verses, I think it's important that giving is important. In Psalms chapter 54, verses 6 and 7, David says, "I will freely sacrifice to you. I will praise your name, O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me out of all trouble, and my eyes has seen its desire upon my enemies." So when we look at the scripture in Mark, the widow seemed to know that whatever she gave, God was worth it. David seemed to do the same. They willingly sacrificed to give. And I think that's when we think about the widow mite, that the gift that she gave was a sacrifice. So I think when we think about our giving, are we sacrificing? Or are we just giving out of our abundance like the others did there? Time, the management of your money matters. Be faithful in it. So when you think about all those things, the talents that we have, what we do with our means, we have the parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25. And I think we all know it, but basically the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his own ability, and immediately he went on a journey. Then he who received the 5 talents went, traded them, and made another 5 talents. And likewise he who received 2 gained 2 more, but he who received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. After a long time the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So he who received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I've gained 5 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you a ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. He also who had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I've gained 2 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many. Enter into the joy of our Lord, of your Lord. Then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew that you were a hard man, reaping where you had not sown, and gathered where you had not scattered seed. I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look there, you have what is yours. But his Lord answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reaped where I had not sown, and gathered where I had not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But for him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So faithfulness does depend on us and what we do. So when you think about the parable of the talents, there was talents that they had and what they did with it and what was required. And there is an example of the judgment. So when we think about our faithfulness, does it matter? Will it matter at the judgment? Yeah. We all will have, whether we have 5 talents or 2 talents or 1 talent, whatever we have, we're going to all be judged accordingly. But one of the points that it makes it was each according to what their ability was. So you're not going to have more than what you can handle, but you need to handle what God's given us. So we have to use that ability, use our talents that God's given us. Are there areas in your life that you don't want to turn over to God? So when you think about being faithful, are there any areas that we have that it's just not something you want to turn over to God? Shouldn't be, should there? Shouldn't be. If there is, then why are we holding on to those? One of the things it talks about in this book, it talks about different situations that people go through where, whether it's a wife of a husband who abuses her, and yet they stay in those situations, and so sometimes we have to have the faith, and we have to be faithful when it comes to helping people where we know that there's situations that aren't good. How can God's power and God's faithfulness in the past encourage you to trust Him in the future? Can we look at what God did for those in the Old Testament and how He led and provided for, and then how Christ came and what Christ did to know that what He can do for us? Is it worth us to be faithful in our lives? Yeah. Do you ever pause and thank God right in the middle of a problem before the answer comes? And we've talked about that before, prayer. We can go to prayer with God anytime. But sometimes when you're in the middle of something and you're not sure what to do, and maybe it's the prayer, stop and say a prayer, and then kind of clear your mind. Why do we sometimes blame sin on our failure to avoid wrongful behavior? Are we guilty of that? Why do we sometimes blame sin on our failure to avoid wrongful behavior? That was a Flip Wilson who says, the devil made me do it. So we're all tempted. We're all led. We fall when we're enticed by our own lusts and desires. But we're all tempted. We're all going to be tempted and tried. And the more that we work with the fruit of the Spirit that we've talked about, is the more we can overcome those temptations and walk the right path. Identify one area in your Christian life where faithfulness is a particular problem right now, if you have that. And what can you do to improve your faithfulness in that area? So as we think about being more faithful, if you have an issue with doing that, we need to resolve that and fix that. And again, just like we talked about exhorting each daily, can I come to you if I see you once a week or twice a week if I have an issue? Or do you know I have an issue because I don't talk to anybody today? We need to, I guess what I'm saying is we need to know each other better. We need to know when somebody's down, when something's not right in their life, and try to help them. Because of our pride, sometimes we don't let out that we have issues and that we need help. But as Christians, that's what we're here to do. When you think about people who have issues, if they don't come here, where else might they go? To the world? And what are the world's answers for things? Yeah, have a bar, have a drink. Drink your problems away, right? What happens when not that we've done that, but what happens if somebody drinks their problems away? There's more problems when they wake up the next morning. So the world doesn't have the answers. We have the answers. The Bible, Jesus provides the answers. We have to be there to help and provide that for them. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Any other comments before the doorbell rings?